Hello, welcome to the last chapter of Roald Dahl's George's Marvellous Medicine. If you've been following along, thank you so much and well done. I've really enjoyed reading to you guys, and I hope that you've enjoyed listening and answering some of the questions too. So chapter 15, what did you like about the book? Has it reminded you of any other stories that you've read to yourself or you've heard read to you? And could you write a story or tell a story that follows on from this one, like a second version of the book? Is there anything that you would put into your story that tells us a little bit about the characters and what might happen next? Okay, so sit back, relax and enjoy our last chapter. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it would be, George said. Give up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in, you'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me up my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho-ho!" she cried. "Ha-ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourselves all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of tea in the morning, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and you drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's marvellous—" "Everything's George's round here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of the little George's hands and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No," the other two cried. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine No. 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt his ears. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hose pipes." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than the little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel? How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller, and by golly, she was." When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch a hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then. "Well, where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering round with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Ah, well, I suppose it's all for the best." She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief minutes, he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. And there's George having to think about all the things that have just happened to him. Right, that's the end. Excellent, well done. So, I hope you liked it. What was it that you liked about it? Did it make you think of any other stories, maybe with some magic in it? And could you write a story or tell a story that follows on from this one? Do you think Grandma's really gone? Or do you think she's just hiding from them? See you later.